As the commercial ventures in Montecito begin to spectacularly unravel and Hollywood elites quietly turn their backs, a new and far more existential threat has emerged from London. The very real impending reality that Prince William is entirely prepared to sever the final formal ties and strip the Sussexes of their royal titles the moment he ascends the throne. I am glad you have joined me today as we begin to unpick the rather complex and frankly ruthless layers of this latest development. The distinguished royal biographer Tom Bower has laid bare a scenario that, quite frankly, should have the Duke and Duchess waking up in a cold sweat amidst their Californian luxury, as he articulates with chilling certainty that their royal status is living on borrowed time. This is no longer the realm of idle speculation or wishful thinking from disgruntled royalists. It is a calculated, strategic inevitability that strikes at the very core of their carefully monetized identities. Without the Duke and Duchess prefix, what remains of their brand is merely the hollow echo of a former television actress who never quite grasped the British sensibility, and a prince who voluntarily exiled himself from the only institution that granted him global relevance. The atmosphere surrounding this revelation is one of profound finality, a stark contrast to the endless, cyclical drama the Sussexes have cultivated over the past 5 years, signaling that the era of transatlantic appeasement is drawing to a definitive, uncompromising close. The long-term consequences are absolute. Once the titles are gone, the lucrative speaking engagements, the streaming deals, and the desperate luxury lifestyle launches lose their foundational mystique, leaving them entirely exposed to the brutal, unforgiving whims of an American celebrity market that has already begun to tire of their endless complaints. To truly understand the gravity of this impending shift, we must first examine the historic hesitancy of King Charles III. A monarch who, despite his decades of preparation, has frequently allowed his paternal guilt to override his institutional ruthlessness. Charles is fundamentally a man who desires reconciliation, a father who has endured the sting of public betrayal, yet still harbors a quiet, agonizing hope that his prodigal son might one day see reason and return to the fold in some capacity. This internal emotional conflict has created an atmosphere of paralysis within the palace walls, where courtiers have been forced to walk on eggshells, desperately trying to manage a father's grief while simultaneously protecting the crown from the erratic, financially motivated salvos launched from Montecito. This cautious, almost overly diplomatic approach has unfortunately emboldened the Sussexes, providing them with a false sense of security and the dangerous illusion that the institution would always leave a door slightly ajar for their half-in, half-out fantasies. The long-term consequence of Charles's soft-touch reign in this specific arena is that it has merely delayed the inevitable confrontation, allowing the toxic narrative to fester while the Sussexes continue to cash in on their royal proximity with varying degrees of embarrassing failure. However, this period of royal grace is intrinsically tied to Charles's mortality and his reign, a fact that the architects of the Sussex brand seem to have disastrously underestimated in their long-term strategic planning, completely misjudging the temperament of the man who will follow. The dynamic shifts entirely, however, the moment we look toward the future, as Prince William is not burdened by the same paralyzing parental guilt, nor does he view the monarchy through a lens of sentimental compromise or public relations therapy. William operates with a fierce, almost clinical protectiveness over the institution's survival, and more intimately over his wife, Catherine, who has endured entirely unprovoked, venomous darts from across the pond with remarkable dignified silence amidst her own profound health challenges. When William's influence is brought to bear on matters concerning his brother, the atmospheric pressure within the palace drops noticeably. A well-placed source has noted the distinct, chilling lack of sentimentality that now dictates the Prince of Wales' approach to the California branch of the family. He views their endless public grievances and tacky commercial ventures not merely as family squabbles, but as direct existential threats to the dignity and stability of the crown his children will one day inherit, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or emotional blackmail. Consequently, William is actively, albeit quietly, drawing up the blueprints for a streamlined, fortress-like monarchy where transatlantic detractors are starved of the oxygen of association and completely legally detached from the institution they so loudly despise yet desperately cling to for profit. The long-term reality of this unyielding stance is that William will not engage in a public war of words. He will simply use the constitutional machinery at his disposal to definitively sever the connection, ensuring the Sussexes become a cautionary footnote in history rather than an ongoing migraine for the crown. Over in the sprawling, overly mortgaged estates of Montecito, the realization of this approaching immovable wall has reportedly triggered a state of rising panic and frantic reassessment within whatever remains of the Sussex camp. According to Bauer, Prince Harry is genuinely terrified by the prospect of losing his titles, a fear rooted in the dawning horror that his brother cannot be manipulated by Oprah Winfrey interviews, tell-all memoirs, or carefully orchestrated paparazzi strolls. The internal monologue for Harry must be a uniquely isolating one, as he watches the protective armor of his birthright slowly cracking under the weight of his own hubris and his wife's relentless, entirely misguided public relations strategies that have alienated nearly everyone of consequence. The atmosphere behind the gates of their mansion is said to be intensely fraught. A source behind closed doors whispers of tense, high-stakes strategy meetings where the looming shadow of a King William dictates every desperate, rushed product launch and bizarre public appearance. They are frantically trying to establish an independent commercial foothold, be it through baffling lifestyle brands or awkward, highly produced surfing videos, before the royal drawbridge is permanently pulled up, leaving them stranded on the other side of the moat with nothing but their victimhood to sell. The tragic consequence of this panicked scramble is that the harder they try to force their relevance and demand respect as global leaders, the more transparent and cheapened their brand becomes, accelerating the very irrelevance they are so desperately trying to outrun. This strategy of slow, institutional suffocation that William favors is not born out of petty vindictiveness, but rather a cold, necessary exercise in royal hygiene and long-term brand protection. William's internal logic is remarkably clear and ruthlessly pragmatic. The monarchy survives on a delicate balance of public trust, historical mystique, and dignified duty, all of which are actively eroded every time a royal title is used to peddle overpriced jam or justify a multi-million-dollar streaming grievance fest. The courtiers who once attempted to broker peace and appease the Sussexes have now read the writing on the wall, firmly aligning themselves with William's zero-tolerance policy and ensuring that the transitional plans for his eventual reign leave absolutely no room for ambiguity regarding the Sussex titles. This unified front creates a suffocating atmosphere for any remaining sympathizers within the establishment, effectively isolating Harry and Meghan from any back-channel negotiations or secret lifelines they might have hoped to rely upon when their American ventures inevitably run dry. Ultimately, the long-term consequence of this strategy is that Harry and Meghan will not be afforded the luxury of a dramatic, martyr-making expulsion that they could instantly spin into another lucrative documentary. Instead, they will be subjected to a quiet, bureaucratic severing of ties. They will wake up one day to find that the official letters patent have been altered, the royal websites definitively updated, and their last remaining shred of global leverage has been quietly, ruthlessly swept away, leaving them entirely to their own devices in a world that has already stopped paying attention. To truly grasp the precarious nature of the Sussexes' current arrangement, One only has to look at the swift and entirely unsentimental precedent set by the handling of Prince Andrew, a situation that proves the monarchy's ultimate priority is always its own survival. When the reputational damage surrounding the Duke of York reached a critical threshold, the institution did not hesitate to excise him from public life, stripping him of military affiliations and severely curtailing his royal presence with a cold, calculated efficiency that left no room for appeal. This was not merely a family dispute managed behind closed doors. It was a highly visible institutional amputation designed to protect the broader crown from the toxic fallout of one individual's catastrophic misjudgments and deeply embarrassing associations. A well-placed source has indicated that this exact playbook remains very much open and accessible on the desks of senior courtiers, serving as a silent, terrifying reminder to those in California that royal privilege is entirely conditional and can be revoked the moment it becomes a liability. The internal panic for Prince Harry, who witnessed this dramatic fall from grace firsthand, must be agonizing, as he realizes the very same bureaucratic machinery that neutralized his uncle is now quietly humming in the background, assessing the ongoing damage inflicted by the Montecito enterprise. Ultimately, the long-term consequence of the Andrew precedent is the complete evaporation of the illusion that bloodline alone guarantees lifelong status, establishing a modern reality where the survival of the king and the crown will always fiercely outweigh the grievances of a minor, non-working royal overseas. The mechanics of actually removing these titles are, of course, anchored in constitutional law rather than mere palace whim. Yet this legal reality offers very little actual comfort to a duke and duchess whose global branding relies entirely on an increasingly fragile connection to London. Under the current legal framework of the United Kingdom, altering the line of succession or formally stripping a peerage requires an Act of Parliament, a significant legislative hurdle that would naturally demand government cooperation and a unified political will to execute. However, as the public patience for the couple's endless litany of complaints continues to wear astonishingly thin across Britain, it is not difficult to imagine a future where Prince William, acting as king, easily commands the necessary political capital to endorse such a parliamentary maneuver without facing any meaningful domestic opposition. Someone close to palace circles has noted a distinct shift in the legal tone during high-level discussions, suggesting that the once unthinkable prospect of legislative intervention is now viewed as a viable, albeit final, contingency plan to definitively cauterize the Sussex wound. For Harry and Meghan, the atmospheric pressure surrounding this constitutional reality must be suffocating, replacing their initial arrogant assumption of untouchability with the creeping dread that they are entirely at the mercy of a British public and a parliament they have spent years actively alienating. The long-term reality is that once the legislative gears are set in motion, there is absolutely no reversing the process, and the titles that currently artificially inflate their multi-million-dollar streaming contracts will be permanently consigned to the history books, exposing the fundamental emptiness of their independent commercial appeal. This creeping vulnerability extends inevitably to the styling of their children, Archie and Lilibet, who currently hold the titles of Prince and Princess purely by virtue of conventions that are themselves subject to the sweeping modernizations a new reign will undoubtedly bring. The decision to aggressively broadcast and utilize these titles in America was widely perceived as a deeply cynical branding exercise, an attempt to lock in generational royal status while simultaneously refusing to contribute a single day of working service to the institution that provides it. This contradiction has not gone unnoticed by a public that correctly views the monarchy as a covenant of duty rather than a Hollywood merchandising opportunity, making the children's styling a uniquely vulnerable target in any future streamlining of the royal framework. A source within the inner circle suggests that the broader palace establishment views the retention of these titles by entirely absent, American-raised children as structurally illogical, and quite frankly, a lingering administrative vulnerability that Prince William will be highly motivated to resolve. The internal monologue for Meghan Markle in particular must be one of intense frustration, as she realizes that the prestigious labels she so desperately secured for her children may simply fade into irrelevance or be actively formally reviewed, rendering her grand transatlantic royal dynasty remarkably short-lived. Ultimately, the consequence of tying their children's public identities to an institution they have so viciously attacked is that they have placed Archie and Lilibet squarely on the fault line of a coming royal earthquake, guaranteeing that the inevitable restructuring will have deeply personal and permanent ramifications for their family. Behind the high walls and manicured hedges of their Californian estate, the psychological toll of this impending reality is beginning to manifest in increasingly frantic attempts to pivot, driven by a creeping dread that their royal currency is rapidly approaching its expiration date. They are no longer dealing with the patient, forgiving courtiers of the previous era. They are facing a modernized, highly disciplined institution that is entirely prepared to cut them adrift to protect the long-term stability of the reign. This profound realization has fundamentally altered the atmosphere within their sprawling mansion, shifting from the defiant, triumphant tone of their initial exodus to a deeply paranoid, reactive posture where every business failure and public misstep is magnified by the knowledge that their safety net is being actively dismantled. A source behind closed doors describes an environment of constant, exhausting pivoting, where grand philanthropic illusions are hastily swapped for jam-selling ventures and bizarrely staged surfing videos in a desperate, undignified scramble to find anything that sticks before the titles are formally pulled. The emotional reality for the couple is a continuous, punishing cycle of hubris followed by humiliation, as they realize that the global influence they assumed was their right was, in fact, merely a temporary lease granted by the very family they sought to destroy. The devastating consequence of this isolation is that they are entirely alone in their commercial freefall, devoid of the world-class advisors they abandoned in London, and surrounded instead by Hollywood sycophants who will vanish the very second the word royal is legally stripped from their letterhead. When that inevitable day arrives and the titles are finally formally removed, the illusion of luxury and exclusive access that currently underpins the entire Sussex enterprise will evaporate overnight, leaving behind a stark and highly unmarketable reality. The American entertainment industry, for all its performative progressive posturing, is fundamentally ruthless and transactional. It was charmed by the novelty of a renegade duke and duchess, but it has absolutely no lasting use for a middle-aged former basic cable actress, and a man entirely devoid of practical skills once the royal shine has worn off. Without the institutional prestige to leverage, their demands for top-tier speaking fees, premium production deals, and deferential treatment will be met with the cold, hard arithmetic of a market that correctly views them as yesterday's news. A longtime family acquaintance has quietly observed that the couple has spectacularly failed to build any genuine independent credibility outside of complaining about the crown, meaning that the removal of their titles will instantly collapse the fragile house of cards they have spent 5 years attempting to construct in California. The internal devastation will be absolute, as the crushing realization sets in that they traded a lifetime of guaranteed global respect and profound historical significance for a fleeting, ultimately embarrassing moment as disposable reality television fodder. In the end, the long-term consequence of their arrogance will be total irrelevance. They will be remembered not as the modernizing trailblazers they so desperately wanted to be, but as a cautionary tale of spectacular self-sabotage, stripped of their rank and entirely forgotten by the world they tried to conquer. The grand vision of American Riviera Orchard has collided spectacularly with the unforgiving reality of retail, exposing a deeply embarrassing lack of basic business acumen from the Duchess that threatens to collapse the entire Montecito facade. A source behind closed doors has whispered of increasingly frantic scenes within their sprawling estate, where the atmosphere is thick with bruised egos and the undeniable physical presence of unsold inventory lingering in storage rooms like a monument to their own hubris. It seems the initial arrogance that fueled this launch, the assumption that simply slapping a pseudo-royal crest on a jar of preserves would guarantee a commercial empire, has entirely evaporated, replaced by Meghan's profound, isolating bewilderment as the American consumer outright rejects her pricing strategy. We are witnessing the rapid disintegration of the luxury illusion they so desperately tried to cultivate, as the stark realization sets in that a title does not automatically equate to talent, and proximity to the crown cannot mask a fundamentally flawed product line. The long-term consequence of this very public commercial floundering is the permanent degradation of their brand, from exclusive top-tier royalty to desperate D-list influencers, forced to hawk increasingly bizarre homewares simply to keep the lights on in California. The sheer incompetence of their recent promotional rollout perfectly encapsulates this descent into commercial absurdity, particularly when one examines the frankly insulting mathematics applied to their latest spread and chocolate duo. It requires a special kind of arrogance to assume the public will simply turn a blind eye to being overcharged, yet they inexplicably priced a bundle at $29 when purchasing the items individually would cost a mere $26, completely misunderstanding the very concept of a consumer discount. A well-meaning staff member has reportedly expressed sheer dismay at this elementary failure in strategy, describing a chaotic, reactive environment where basic quality control is routinely sacrificed on the altar of Meghan's unyielding defensive insistence that her branding is infallible. The internal dynamic must be agonizing, as Harry watches the remnants of his royal dignity being tied to a fundamentally flawed retail operation, while his wife stubbornly refuses to acknowledge that she is effectively ripping off the few loyalists she has left. Ultimately, the long-term consequence of this nickel-and-diming approach is the total evaporation of whatever remaining trust the public held, cementing their reputation not as purveyors of fine, aspirational goods, but as careless grifters attempting to squeeze every last cent out of a rapidly dwindling fan base. This astonishing lack of attention to detail extends far beyond simple arithmetic, reaching a crescendo of embarrassment with the revelation that prominent pop culture commentators are receiving promotional items that are fundamentally defective. When an influencer of Dana Bowling's reach publicly reveals that an exclusive, highly anticipated candle arrived completely devoid of a wick, it exposes a staggering operational incompetence that would bankrupt any normal startup within a matter of weeks. Someone close to palace circles has reportedly observed this unfolding disaster with a mixture of horror and grim amusement, noting that the protective machinery of the British monarchy would never have permitted such a humiliating, amateurish oversight to reach the public domain. The emotional reality within the Sussex camp is reportedly one of utter denial, an absolute refusal to engage in self-reflection or better themselves, choosing instead to bury their heads in the sand rather than admit their production lines are a shambles. The devastating, unavoidable consequence of sending out poorly manufactured, unusable products is the permanent destruction of their credibility within the vital, highly competitive luxury market, proving once and for all that without the palace courtiers to manage the details, they are entirely out of their depth. Perhaps the most glaring symbol of their current desperation is the deeply embarrassing, widely mocked surfing footage of Prince Harry that recently surfaced, a spectacle that reeks of a midlife crisis tightly wrapped in a frantic public relations maneuver. Observers instantly dissected the polished, awkward clip, noting that in an era where generating hyper-realistic videos using advanced artificial intelligence is remarkably accessible, this particular footage felt suspiciously enhanced, disconnected entirely from the authentic reality of a man approaching his 40s. A longtime family acquaintance has quietly lamented how far the prince has fallen, describing the crushing atmospheric pressure he must feel to constantly project this manufactured, effortless coastal cool simply to justify his exile to a profoundly skeptical American audience. The internal monologue for Harry, caught attempting to merchandise a surf school while simultaneously relying on heavily edited, artificially smoothed smoke and mirrors, must be one of profound humiliation and exhaustion, as the sheer effort required to sustain this false narrative becomes increasingly unsustainable. The long-term consequence of attempting to pass off such blatantly artificial, overly polished content as reality is the complete and utter destruction of their final, most crucial asset, their authenticity, rendering them nothing more than a laughingstock in a digital age that ruthlessly punishes such transparent deception. The overarching tragedy of this Montecito empire is that it was built entirely on a foundation of grievance and unearned superiority, leaving it incredibly brittle when faced with the actual, rigorous demands of running a viable commercial enterprise. They demanded the deference of royalty while operating with the sheer incompetence of amateur influencers, creating a toxic, unworkable environment that has alienated partners, confused consumers, and stripped away the very mystique they sought to monetize. A source behind closed doors suggests that the slow, dawning realization of this comprehensive failure is beginning to fracture whatever unity remained within their camp, as the harsh spotlight of public ridicule exposes the vast, undeniable chasm between their grandiose ambitions and their actual capabilities. The psychological toll of watching their supposedly bulletproof billion-dollar brand collapse into a series of petty pricing scandals and digital embarrassments must be utterly devastating, a daily reminder that they have spectacularly misjudged their own appeal. The ultimate consequence of this commercial implosion is that they are now entirely vulnerable, not just to the structural constitutional maneuvers of Prince William, but to the harsh, unforgiving social freeze-out from the very Hollywood elite they so desperately sought to impress, which we must now turn our attention to. The final indignity for the Sussexes is the absolute freeze-out from the Hollywood elite they desperately courted, starkly highlighted when Nicki Minaj publicly mocked Harry, suggesting he simply phone home like E.T. A source within the inner circle notes this A-list rejection extends to the Kardashians, who swiftly deleted charity event photos featuring the couple, recognizing them as undeniable reputational liabilities. Furthermore, their aggressively toxic fan base viciously attacks critics online, exposing the sheer hypocrisy of a duke and duchess who endlessly preach mental wellness, yet remain conspicuously silent when their own supporters rage. Ultimately, as their Californian fortress crumbles, the inescapable long-term consequence is their total, irreversible isolation.